Hi, folks. Great to see all of you here tonight. My name's Allison Sansoni. I'm the program director here at the American Writers Museum. A quick show of hands, how many of you are here for the first time? Wonderful, welcome. And for those of you for whom this is not your first visit, welcome back. If you like the kinds of programs that you see here on a regular basis and you like the kinds of exhibits that you've seen here in your visits, you can become a member up at our front desk and enjoy free admission to the museum and discounted tickets to programs and special events like our happy hour series, Get Lit, which next week will feature an anti-Valentine's theme, complete with a rejection letter open mic that we did last year, which was a howling good time. You've got to see it. It's great. I also want to welcome everyone who's joining us online. And for those of you online who want to become a member, you can go to our website at americanwritersmuseum.org. If you don't yet have a copy of the book for tonight's program, you can get that from our bookstore partner, Seminary Co-op, which is right behind you in the back. This program is offered in conjunction with our exhibit, Dark Testament, A Century of Black Writers on Justice. I want to thank you all for being here and for supporting the past, present, and future of American writing. In 1940, two psychologists asked Black children to choose between two dolls, one white and one black. Their answers would form the basis for studying the effects of and eventually attempting to dismantle legal segregation in American society. Tim Spofford tells the story of the psychologist who pioneered the study in What the Children Told Us. He has a doctorate in English and has worked for years in classrooms and newsrooms, written for the New York Times, Newsday, Mother Jones Magazine, and many other publications. He's also the author of Lynch Street, a documentary account of the Jackson State killings in Mississippi in May of 1970. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Allison, for that introduction. And I'm dismantling the furniture here now.
Oh no.
There we go.
There we go.
Righty.
Well, thank you for being here and discussing this with us. Tell us a little bit about what the doll test was and why it was so important.
Well, the doll test was a test of, I guess you could say, racial identity for children from the ages of about 2 to 8. Most of the children were well above 2, but there were a few that were 2 and 3 toddlers. The Clarks would, Kenneth was the one who was administering it. Mamie was very busy giving birth and raising 2 children. So he was the one who went out into the field, and he would show a child 4 dolls, and they'd be in a staggered, integrated lineup. So no 2 white dolls together, 2 black dolls together. There's black, brown, white, brown, white. And then he would say, the first question would always be, which is the doll that you would like to play with? Which is the doll that you like best? And then another question would be, which is the nice doll? The next question would be, which is the bad doll? And always the last question was, which is the doll that looks like you? And now the children that they tested were only Black children. That's all. At the time, they did the testing both in the South and in the North. And in the South, a Black professor like Kenneth Clark could not even get inside a white school, much less question a white child or touch a white child. I mean, that was verboten. That was absolutely taboo. And so the 2/3 of the children opted for a white doll. They said they preferred a white doll. And some of the children had made pejorative remarks about the doll that closest really resembled them or represented them. And some of the children, definitely a tiny minority, a fraction, but some of the children denied they were even Black. And some of the children cried and ran out of the testing room. So Kenneth felt pretty guilty about that. And but the doll test was more than just the doll test. We always focus on that, but the test was actually quite a bit more complicated. It had an IQ test that was part of it. There was a coloring test that Mamie developed. And so there was, the children were asked to take crayons of various colors and color the picture of really a line drawing of a boy, the color that you think boys should be, and the color that you think girls should be, that kind of thing. And they would contrast these with the doll test scores and look for some sort of consistency or lack thereof. There was also a sketch test where the children were asked to indicate whether they identified with a picture of a Black boy or a Black girl or a white boy or a white girl. And there was a certain kind of internal consistency. I mean, if you look at all the children, it was more than 253 that they tested. In 1940 and 1941, but 2/3 of the children opted for the white doll as their favorite, the one they wanted to play with, the one they'd like to have.
Tell us a little bit about the Clarks and how they came to be studying this.
Well, a lot of what I am saying about the action, the activity behind the doll test revolves around Kenneth because he's the one who actually did the testing. But Mamie was actually really central, totally central. And if it weren't for Mamie, we wouldn't be sitting here right now listening to this conversation. Mamie did a master's degree at Howard. That's where she and Kenneth met, Howard University in Washington. And her project for her master's thesis was to try to study the age at which children begin to demonstrate a consciousness of self as distinct human beings. Now, that actually had nothing to do with race, really. But she heard about this prior test by Ruth Horowitz, Dr. Ruth Horowitz in New York City, psychologist. And Dr. Ruth, she did this test using drawings of only Black boys and white boys, but also, oddly, animals like a rooster, a dog, a lion. There might have been one or two other animals, and to try to test to see with only nursery school children to see whether they had a sense of themselves as human beings yet. And some of the kids actually were so young and undeveloped that they actually opted for some of the animals. And so this is how first Dr. Horowitz and then Mamie began to make decisions about, or guesses, good guesses based on information, data, when children really begin to sense that they are human beings. But in that first test for her master's, there was a strange thing that some of the Black children were opting for, they identified with the picture of the white boy or the white girl. And actually Ruth didn't use girls. She only used boys. That was another problem with that test. And so what Mamie's thesis was doing is really testing Ruth's test to see if it was valid, to see if it was any good. Because Dr. Horowitz theorized that these Black children that answered the way they did by opting for the pictures of a white boy really wished they were white. And Mamie didn't agree with that. She didn't think that was accurate. That was Mamie's hypothesis. And in doing her own test, She wanted to see whether Ruth's really held up to scrutiny. It was a very ambitious master's thesis. She tested more than 200 children, and she tested children in New York and in Washington, D.C. Again, only Black children. Again, because of segregation in Washington, D.C., which was a totally, strictly segregated city, our nation's capital, she would not be allowed inside the doors of a white school. So, okay, after that came out, she and Kenneth became fascinated. Kenneth was a doctoral student at the time at Columbia, while Mamie was finishing her master's, and he became more interested in that than his own dissertation. And so he wasn't finished with this, and she wasn't finished with it either. What about this theory of wishful thinking that they were white? So they decided to design a more sensitive test with dolls. And I think they probably did kind of hit the jackpot. But unfortunately, maybe a little too sensitive, because Kenneth came to the decision that really he kind of harmed some of these children. He made them feel very, very ill at ease, anxious, weeping, and so on. He felt really guilty.
You touched on this a moment ago, but tell us a little bit about what the environment was that the Clarks were doing this work in, the segregation, the separation of Black and white children.
Sure. Well, they did the testing first in Springfield, Massachusetts, which had a long tradition. Massachusetts had a considerably long tradition of integrated schooling. This is 1940, October of 1940. And that's the kind of state Massachusetts was. And I would call that a nominally integrated state. However, Arkansas, where Mamie was from and where Kenneth did the second half of the testing, was a strictly segregated southern state. So now what were schools and institutions like at that time with regard to segregation? Let's start with schooling, because that's really what this book is about. Chiefly about, it's about segregation throughout American life. But in any case, in schooling, if you were a Southern Black child and you were a teenager and you were living in a rural area, there was a darn good chance you weren't going to get into a high school, because there was none in your rural community. And, you know, the school board, the white school board, was happy with that. I mean, no problem. In those rural communities, would you believe Black parents had to very often buy the land? They had to buy the lumber and the roofing materials. They had to actually help construct the school building. They got little or no help from the school board whatsoever. No school buses. The white kids got the buses, but not the Black kids. The schools often seeded with money from Jacob Rosenwald. Am I getting the first name right? Something's telling me no. But Julius Rosenwald from Chicago. Julius Rosenwald was connected to the Sears retail industry, and he was a tycoon, had a lot of money, and he helped, provided seed money. He didn't pay the full freight, but he provided the seed money to build schools throughout the South. So a lot of those schools I'm talking about are called Rosenwald schools. And in many cases, because of the very flimsy construction and so on, they had leaking roofs. Virtually all in the rural areas had outhouses. This is into the 1950s, by the way. That's when I was a kid. I mean, a little kid. Into the 1950s, my Black contemporaries at that time were going to schools without water fountains. They had a bucket, perhaps a dipper. That's how you got your water. Maybe that was put on the front steps of the schoolhouse, which was rickety and flimsy, made of wood, and there were pot-bellied stove. I'm talking chiefly about rural areas, pot-bellied stove. If the coals went out on the floor, you took a pair of tongs. One kid had to take a pair of tongs and throw the embers back into the fire. Let's see, can you imagine outhouses? Oh, it's just terrible. So that's the way the schools were. As far as other institutions, the Clarks are a pretty good example. The book goes into some detail about that. They both went to Ivy League school, Columbia, to get their doctorates. Both became psychologists, PhDs, and they both had a hell of a time in the 1940s getting their first job. It was very discouraging, and especially for Mamie, who wanted to hire a female scholar, white or black. But if you were black, I mean, wow, your chances of getting a job in academia were just about nil. Everything was segregated. And even in New York City, the hospitals that blacks were expected to attend was Harlem Hospital. Only black nurses could work there, and the only hospital they could serve in as interns, beginning practicing nurses, was Harlem Hospital. Everything about our society was totally segregated. Housing, if you wanted an FHA loan, you weren't going to get it if you were black. I mean, virtually no one got it. The GI Bill, if you wanted a GI Bill, not many black soldiers got the GI Bill. That's America, North or South. And I always thought it was kind of interesting that the Clark's doll test results were pretty much the same, both for the kids from the integrated schools and the kids from the segregated schools. Because even if the kids went to an integrated school, the general society was rigidly segregated. I grew up in that world in the 1950s. I was a little kid. I didn't grow up in 50s, but I was around, born in 1950. And that was simply the way it was. I mean, you virtually never saw a black face on a television set unless it had something to do with the news and crime. In our magazines, the same thing. I mean, it filtered. When people say today racism is systemic, yeah, it is. It is. And I lived through it. I remember it, all aspects of life.
So when the Clarks began this, they were looking at people's self-image. They were looking at the way they conceived of themselves and what they thought of as good or bad as it related to skin color. What were the effects of this information? What did they do with it?
Oddly, at first, nothing. They had colleagues who wanted them to publish, and they didn't for 7 long years. And it's kind of amazing. And I think of it this way, that Kenneth felt guilty about doing this test. So that was a part of it. Second of all, they weren't completely certain that they had found what they think they had found. In other words, these were really smart people. These were not people that saw life as pretty simple, cut and dry, black or white. They theorized, their hypothesis was that they had found evidence of an inferiority complex among black children in 1940 and in 1941. They thought that that's what they found. But when they wrote to the Rosenwald Fund, which had basically paid for their study, they reported that it simply, very cautiously, they said, it raised questions about the education and mental hygiene of black children. And they were still being very cagey. They thought they'd found it, but they were still uncertain. That's the way they were. But as Kenneth worked with the NAACP, and Mamie did too, they both testified in the federal courts in the litigation that led to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. As they sat in courtrooms and they listened to all these other social scientists testify, and they read and read more social science tests along the lines of what they had conducted. There were other doll tests right after them. There was suddenly a lot of interest in doll testing, and suddenly white kids started taking doll tests too. And so we got their answers, and that was fascinating to read about as well. But then they became, as they were testifying in court and so on, they became pretty certain that, yeah, we found it. What we thought we found, we found.
And so they, the information that they gathered became the basis for challenging segregation because it demonstrated harm
Yes.
to,
Right.
yeah.
The last major decision in the Supreme Court on this subject of segregation and human psychology was in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that that as long as the facilities in schools, restaurants, hotels, whatever, were equal to white facilities, then separate but equal was fine. And if blacks didn't like that, and that made them feel inferior, then that was pretty much the construction within their own minds. Now that was the arrogant phrasing, and I'm not giving you an exact quote, but that's very close to it, that the Supreme Court in 1896 rendered. So what Thurgood wanted to do was to basically take a look at that. Well, let's look at what this has done to the minds of these children. What are we saying to these kids when they say, no school bus for you? Oh, the white kids can have it. No chem lab for you. Oh, the white kids can have it. No auto shop for you. The white kids can have it though. What are we saying to these children about themselves as human beings? What are we conveying? What is the state of Maryland or Virginia or Delaware saying to that black child? And that's what they were doing in these courtrooms. There were 5 court cases, one in Washington that the NAACP did not push. They supported, but they weren't behind it. But there were 4 states, and Delaware, Virginia, Kansas, and I'm leaving one out. I always do. Oh, South Carolina. Yeah, South Carolina. Those were the states where this testimony played out in the lower court, federal court, before it got to the Supreme Court, rolled up as one case that we now call Brown.
How did you, as a writer, your background is in journalism and education reporting. How did you first become aware of the Clarks and their story?
That's an interesting story. I was just 17 years old, and I learned probably the way a lot of white college students learned about the Dell test in psychology class. So I was in a big auditorium, about 300, 200 students, darkened auditorium, professors up on the psychology prof is up on the stage, lights are on him. It's 8 o'clock in the morning. It's up near the Canadian border. It's freezing cold. And he talked about Kenneth Clark and the doll test, and he told that story. And I thought it was a heartbreaking story. I was only 17, but I was capable of feeling pain at a story like that. And I guess I had journalist's genes, didn't know it. I had a pretty good memory for names, and that comes in handy, doesn't it? And I also loved reading the New York Times. And Kenneth Clark was at that time, he was like the Henry Louis Gates Jr. of the 60s and 70s. He was ubiquitous. He was on television all the time. He was in the New York Times all the time, so often it almost seemed like he ran space there. And it was real easy to follow his career just as a newspaper reader. And so from 17 on, that name stuck with me. I said, oh, it's that guy again. It's that guy again. I'm pretty sure it's the same guy. And so, all right, I leave teaching, which I did quite a few years, and went to journalism. And I got to cover the State Board of Regents. It was like statewide school board, except for they controlled both higher education and what we called little education, K through 12, and both private and public sector. So a very, very powerful board. Kenneth Clark was on that board. And I went to cover the first meeting, and he was there. And I was so moved to see this historic figure, this little, round, soft-voiced, round-shouldered, 70-year-old man speaking to his colleagues, and they're all hanging on his every word. And all these public servants, civil servants are bowing and scraping, kowtowing to him. He's living history. And there are pictures of these white guys, of former regents on the granite walls of the place. You may have heard of some of them. Alexander Hamilton, maybe you heard of him. He was a regent. John Jay, who signed the Declaration of Independence, another founder. He was on, his portrait is there. And then there was this little black man with a soft voice who was, as I said, living history. Well, I got to interview him that day for about an hour and a half. And his wife had recently died. Mamie had died. And so I expressed my condolences to him. He was very depressed. People had prepared me for this. And he put his hand to his stomach and he said, I feel like I've lost an organ. And when he said that, I said to myself, somebody's got to write this guy's biography. There's a great love story here. And I eventually got to write it.
How did you approach the story when you first started writing it, and did that change during the writing process?
Well, definitely. I don't think anybody writes what they think they're going to at the outset. That's for sure. The first part of your question was what? What was that?
How did you first approach the story, and then how did that change?
Well, if by approach you mean how did I research it, I'd read some books about how to write a biography, which is, I think, a good way a neophyte biographer approaches the task, get a sense of how other people have done it. And I got good advice, and that was go out and interview all the old people you need to talk to first. Mm-hmm. Okay, as you read this book, there's a lot of quotations from people who knew the Clarks, and they're in here, and they're speaking to you from the grave, because I interviewed them a long time ago. And so that was terrific advice. I have to tell you that Kenneth this is part of why it took so long to write this and research it. Kenneth was a pack rat. He kept everything, and his papers were voluminous. They're in the Library of Congress, and there were almost 500 boxes. If you're going to read every word, and I would recommend that anybody who does a biography do that, read every word written by the people you're writing about. I mean, that takes some time. So I lived almost a year in Washington over a period of years doing all that. And that was really exciting. And that really got me fired up, particularly their love letters, which they had written in the, every summer. And in the 2 or 3 years they were separated. He was up in New York City at Columbia getting his doctorate, and she's at Howard at the end doing her master's thesis. Well, boy, what a great way to get a good fix on a personality, to take two psychologists no less, who are psychoanalyzing each other. And I mean, I'm just sitting there and I'm reading. I'm saying, hey, man, this is great. You know, they're making it easy for me. So I didn't expect that. I didn't think anybody was going to make it that easy for me.
So you mentioned their children previously, and so how has dealing with their family been for you while you were working on this book?
it's always difficult. I had a literary agent once whom I returned to, and he said, "No, I don't want to. I don't think this is the book for me." But he said, "Stay away from the family. Stay away from the family." That way is always trouble, and I ignored him because I felt, "Hey, how the heck am I going to write this book? The book I want to write, the book. What is it like to really be Black in a family, in a house, in a home, surrounded by segregated institutions of every kind, and how you interact with that world, and how do the children interact with that same world, and so on." Well, there's really only one way, in my opinion, and that is to approach the family. And so I did. And I cut a deal with the family, so to speak. Kate, daughter Kate, she told me one day after I interviewed her, I've interviewed her many, many times for hours, and she told me that she felt a little funny about something she said how her mother related to her in-laws, and she was worried about how I'd represent that. And so I said, "Well, Kate, don't worry about that. Tell you what I'm going to do. You want to see what I'm writing?" "Yes, I do. I really want to see it." "Okay. So if you want to see what I'm writing and have an opportunity to comment on it, here's the deal. I will turn it over to you. I'm not going to allow you to censor anything. But if you find a mistake, I want you to notify me and help me get it right." So that was a deal. And so when I finally finished my first draft, and it was about 40% longer than what you've got there, and it's not exactly a short book. I called her up one day and talked to her, and so I said, "Well, what'd you think? What'd you think?" And a couple times she had called me and said, "This is inaccurate. That's inaccurate." And she said, I think it is a very, very, very good book." That is what she said to me. Now, other members of the family apparently since have a different take on that, and exactly what that is, I don't know. I don't know, but I know I upheld my end of the bargain. I did my best to make it as accurate as I could. And if you read that book, you will discover that unlike, let's just say, quickie biographies, there's an awful lot of detail in it, and it's written like a novel. So there's an incredible amount of detail, and there's a lot of opportunity to get things wrong. And I did everything I could do not to get it wrong.
What is you mentioned learning about the doll test in one of your college classes. So is it still performed and taught today?
Yes, college students are still learning about it, and it's being replicated even today. There have been subsequent doll tests all over the world. This is a very famous test. It's been replicated that I know of in Italy, Union of South Africa, Trinidad and Tobago, Australia, New Zealand, and I'm sure some that I left out, and in multiple states across the United States. It wouldn't surprise me if every single state somebody has done a doll test. The two boxes in the Library of Congress that have the papers related to the doll test, the test sheets, they're actual test sheets with all of Kenneth's quotes and scribbling on them. He quoted the children, the things they said. He took notes on the grimaces or the grins or the cries that they uttered when they were being tested. That's all down there. And I do stray from my main point there. Where was I? I'm sorry.
Oh, you were talking about the other places that the doll test has been replicated.
Okay. Those two boxes are among the most popular in the Library of Congress. And it's not just scholars that go into those boxes, it's kids, because even children, high school kids, have performed doll tests. Now there's a young girl, well, she's not a young girl anymore, she's a young woman, Carrie Davis. She and her mom, her mother helped her, I gather, do a doll test of her own, and they filmed it. And she also filmed a number of her friends, her classmates, girls, commenting on how they felt about their racial identity. And she produced a 7-minute video that you can get on YouTube. So even children, even kids, a lot of college kids have done this. In fact, Kenneth once said that he gave the 4 original dolls away to a Columbia or Barnard or Columbia University student who was doing a doll test study, and she never returned them. So
I do want to give folks a chance to ask some questions, but before I do that, you brought some photographs of some of the people and the places in this book, and so we're going to try and get those up on the screen so that you can take us through those.
The book is a biography. It is not a scholarly study of just a doll test. It is the Clark story, and so I'm trying to see.
No, it's directly behind you. There you are.
Okay. All right. Maybe I should.
Here.
Can I actually pick it up?
There you go.
All right. Maybe I should go out here. Oh, well, okay. How's this work? Does this work right here? I'll just back and forth. Okay. These are the Clarks. And as you can see, Mamie was a very, very beautiful young woman. Very popular at Howard University. She and Kenneth met there. You're looking at them at a time in their life that I think is very appropriate. This is in the late 40s, early 50s, but I think it's probably the late 40s. And they've already accomplished much of what the big things in their life, and they're really, really young. Kenneth, for instance, has finished his. Can we go back to the original picture? Kenneth has completed his doctorate. Mamie has completed hers too. They have raised 2 little children. By this time, their eldest daughter is their only daughter is about 10 years old or 11. And Hilton, he's a little younger, 3 years younger. They have opened a psychiatric clinic. I guess maybe that's too strong a term, but it was a child development center, the Northside Center for Child Development in Harlem for kids at risk. And that still stands today. It still operates. And in fact, it controls, it manages something like 5 Head Start centers in New York City. And may I say that not at this stage quite yet, but Mamie helped found Head Start, a war on poverty program that began in 1965. Everybody in this room has heard of Head Start. And so, yeah, and in some sense, she was kind of the black godmother of it. Most of the people, I believe all the other members of the committee that set up the Head Start centers for the war on poverty were white. And she was the only black woman, and she had a lot to say about how to do it and do it right. And in many ways, Head Start bears a similarity to Northside Center. A lot of Mamie's ideas, like the importance of remedial reading teaching, were informed the curriculum of Head Start. Okay, so let's see. The next. These are Mamie's parents. I'm going to try to give you a sense of who they were and where they came from. This is in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and Mamie's parents were aristocrats of color by the standards of their region and class and their color. they were rich people. Doc Phipps was a physician, had his own practice, but he also ran a hotel. And that nice brick bungalow behind them served as a kind of elite B&B for elite Black guests that would stay there in town. Now, why would a doctor be a hotelier? That seems strange. And by the way, his wife, Kate, his wife helped run the hotel as well. And she managed the B&B, so to speak. It wasn't literally a B&B, but it operated like one because really esteemed Black guests, because maybe the hotel was full or just because they happened to like to meet these people, would stay at their home and they would wine and dine them there. Okay, thing I want you to take away from these two, what was important in their lives with their children, raising their children, education, reading, and education and hard work and what we used to call advancing the race. And that meant helping less fortunate Black neighbors and anything you can do on the national or statewide front to further the cause of civil rights. So that was them. Now that's Doc Phipps and his mother when he was young. He was from the Caribbean. Both these two people, Kenneth and Mamie, had one parent at least from the Caribbean. And Doc Phipps was from St. Kitts, and that's his mom. And then he eventually got on aboard a ship, a steamship, and went to America as a very young man, and with $160 in his wallet. And he managed to find his way to Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, and got his doctorate and a medical doctorate, and then went straight to Hot Springs, which was a lively health spa, resort city. And he knew that there were a lot of ailing Black pilgrims who would go there to take the water cure, and that he could make a good living there. Okay, and the next, this is Mamie's grandparents, the two adults that you see here. Jesse Rufus Smith was born enslaved in Virginia, eventually migrated to Arkansas, which at the time was rumored to be a kind of a paradise for Black people. I'm sure it didn't prove to be quite that, because he became a kind of an agitator. He was a kind of a trade unionist, and he was a church leader. He actually wrote in newspaper articles arguing for better treatment of the Black workers in the bathhouses and resorts of the city. He was quite a guy. And back then in the 1890s and early first decade of the 20th century, that was a dangerous thing to do in the South. Could we go back one more, Christopher? I want to point out that 4 children up there are not Mamie. That's Mamie Smith, by the way. Mamie Clark's namesake. 4 of those children are not hers. I mean, one of those is not hers. Only 3 are. And you might guess, well, gee, that child that looks white with the blonde hair is probably not hers, but you'd be guessing wrong. He actually is her child, her son, and he became quite famous, a member of FDR's Black cabinet. So we're actually, and this is how extraordinary these people, these 2 families were. 2 very famous people came from 2 generations of this same clan, this same family, and that's Alfred E. Smith. Okay, next picture. Now that's Kenneth's family in Panama. Kenneth was born in Panama. The week the Panama Canal actually opened for the first boat to do a test cruise through the canal. So that's 1914. And this is his grandfather you see in the 3-piece suit. He was a supervisor on the docks of Cologne, kind of a port city, boom town, because that was at the gateway. It was the port that was where all the equipment and so on, supplies for building the canal came in, and he gravitated to Cologne for that very reason. There were a lot of jobs on the docks, and he did very nicely. As you can see, he's also rather bourgeois, rather middle class. His son, Kenneth Clark's father, is Arthurton Clark up there with the boutonniere and his lapel, the back row, all the way to the right. That's his father. His father and mother broke up, and his mother left Kenneth when he was 4 years old with his grandmother, and she goes to Harlem with her baby daughter. And this is how much pluck that woman had. All by herself with a daughter, goes to Harlem, knows nobody really very well, and finds a job, rents an apartment in a tenement in Harlem, and gets a job in the garment industry as a seamstress, and manages to raise these two children. Plus, again, education, hard work, and racial solidarity. That's very much a part of her life also, and it was conveyed to Kenneth. She finished her high school diploma while doing all this, all by herself. She went to George Washington High nights, and that's where Kenneth ended up going himself. And she got a high school diploma. In Cologne, you couldn't get a high school diploma. There was no public education no public secondary education in Cologne, Panama. Okay, next picture. That's Kenneth. He's 9 years old at this point, his passport. And he used this passport to spend a year with his grandmother in Jamaica. His family was really Jamaican. He was born in Panama, but his parents were Jamaican. And so it was a family tradition to get an English education. Panama was a Spanish speaking nation. The school system was mostly Spanish. So it was a family tradition. They were very middle class. They were capable of doing it. They sent their children for a number of years to Kingston, Jamaica, to get a British education. And it was a very strict, rather rigorous education. Okay, that's Kenneth. Loved art all his life. There he is as a 12 or 13-year-old, and he was kind of a budding sculptor. And the thing I always found interesting about this is that many of his closest friends later in life were artists, great artists too, great Black artists like Jacob Lawrence, Charles Spinky Alston, and Romare Bearden. Those were all intimates. And he always felt bad that he couldn't cut it as an artist. He really admired and envied really accomplished artists. Okay, next, Christopher. That's Kenneth's mom, and she was a piece of work. She was one tough woman. She really was. One time he went to a cafeteria with her, and they weren't getting served, and his mother sensed that they weren't being served because they were Black, and she picked up a dish and threw it down on the floor and crashed and grabbed Kenneth's hand and stormed out of the restaurant with him. That was a Child's Restaurant, was the name of the chain. This is a picture of the doll test. The famous photographer is, pardon me, Gordon Parks, who is not only was an accomplished photographer, but he was also a filmmaker. But many people in here have seen the movie Shaft. That was his movie. He made that movie. Well, he took this picture for Ebony magazine and a series of articles and many photographs in July 1947 that focused on the Clarks as a couple. Some of the pictures were of them in their home, and some of them were of Kenneth with this boy, at least nominally identified as Peter in this, to simulate the doll test, to give an idea to people what the doll test was like. And probably for most people at that time in 47, that was the first time they ever heard of the doll test. I think this really broke broke the ice for the Clarks, because a lot of good things happened after that came out. A white woman, again, with Chicago ties. Her father was Julius Rosenwald. She took on Northside Center, became president of the board, and she gave an awful lot of money to the Clarks and helped them get out of bankruptcy, because that Northside Center was really it was literally bankrupting them. They were $30,000 in debt at a time when maybe a professor might make $2,000 a year. Okay, now there's Mamie, our second last picture. This is 1943 during World War II. Hilton is the little baby on her lap. He's just been born. She's a PhD student now at Columbia University. And her mom is this is at some neighbor's house, some friend, a relative, neighbor. Her mom, Katie Phipps, is behind her. And that is Kate, the woman I told you about, who threw open her garage to me. And she had, along with those 500 boxes of materials in the Library of Congress, she had about 4 huge boxes full of stuff, including on the top was that picture of the passport of Kenneth when he was 9 years old. When I saw that on the top of that box, I freaked. I said, oh my God, this is fantastic. Okay, final picture. Here are the Clarks at the end of near the end of their lives, unfortunately much closer to Mamie's end than she would have liked or known at this time. This is late in the 70s, and Kenneth has just retired. He started the first Black think tank, a kind of RAND corporation to advance the interests of Black people in America. He had just retired from that, and he had retired after 30 some years teaching at psychology at the City College of New York, which is in Harlem. So he set up a consulting firm, and the whole family was part of that consulting firm. And I think we're done with the pictures.
All right, folks, if you'd like to ask a question, for the folks listening in online, just wait until I bring the mic around. And for those of you who are watching online, type your questions into the Q&A box. So let's get started. Who would like to start?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. This was so great learning about how you wrote this story. And I think my first question is, you had mentioned that they did this testing amongst kids who were in segregated schools and non-segregated schools.
Right.
So I'm wondering how they were able to use their results to provide evidence to support Brown versus Board of Ed, if the results were the same across segregated and non-segregated schools? Well,
the results were not identical. There was an 8% difference, margin of 8%. More, and became very controversial because the segregationists before the Supreme Court made hay out of this. They argued that the segregationists argued that if the Clark's results showed that the Northern children were less likely to select a white doll, let's see if I'm getting this right. If the Southern children were less likely to select a white doll, then what does that say about the terrible effects of segregation? That's almost a quotation of the head of the segregationists legal team. That's what he said before the Supreme Court. So your question was exactly what? Well, I've forgotten now.
Well, basically, I was trying to figure out like what the difference was between the kids in the segregated versus non-segregated schools, or like if the results were the same, which I realize they're not now, how they could use that to argue against segregation.
Well, that's a great question, because that was a segregationist argument. And I think what Kenneth would say is that you couldn't separate out what affect the school versus all the other aspects of American racism are in this child's response. I mean, that's impossible to separate out. Early on, Thurgood Marshall asked Kenneth, Kenneth, does this prove that segregation damages children's minds? No. Does this prove that segregated schools damage children's self-esteem? And Kenneth said, no, it doesn't prove it because there are all these other factors.
So can you speak to, you've alluded to it a little bit, but sometimes I think there is a bit of a distortion of the results. You just spoke to how segregation can damage self-esteem, but I think sometimes it has been, I think, distorted, in my opinion, or misinterpreted to not that this is the effect of racism, but the argument of, well, Black children need to be around white people in order to feel good about themselves, if that makes sense. So not so much about the differences in terms of access to appropriate materials, access to having school buses to get them to school, but more like it's, well, you know, Black children have poor self-esteem because they're among other Black people.
I'm a little confused about what exactly are you asking? Or what?
Did the Clarks talk about that, or from what you have read, did they have a response to that?
I'm not sure they had a response that's public to precisely that argument. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure they would realize, I'm pretty sure that they were sophisticated enough and smart enough to realize that there was a lot of power in that argument. Because, let's put it this way, it has been often said to me from people roughly my age that grew up in segregated schools and neighborhoods, and I'm talking about Black people, that they were never harmed because they were so protected. And that's what actually Mamie said about herself. Mamie was worried when she first put all this data together. She's the one that did all that work, calculating and arranging it all in tables. I mean, that took a lot more time than Kenneth spent testing the kids. Mamie said, geez, I wonder if I'm permanently damaged by this. And she came to the conclusion, no, it wasn't. And why wasn't I? I wasn't because I had a loving family. I had a loving, she was associated with 2 loving and very active churches, and just a Black community that was thriving and very healthy atmosphere in Hot Springs. And so she felt that she had adjusted very well. What Kenneth often said is that, Kenneth said that many of these children adjusted. They adjusted in time. They don't all end up maladjusted. No, but with what amount of burden of pain and suffering most people cannot imagine. That's what he said. So I don't think Kenneth ever said, Dahl test results, therefore Black inferiority complex, case closed, proven. I don't think he ever said that. He had a much more subtle mind than that. And he didn't intend anyone. Now that's part of why he said it raised questions about the education and mental hygiene of Black children. See, that is a really sharp mind.
Fascinating. You mentioned results, the words results, prove, test. My general question is, does a budding writer reach a point where he or she says, you know, I'm fascinated by this topic, but it's so scientific, I just don't want to tackle it? Or do you encourage us? I've got that same problem. I got a memoir, but I've got legal issues. I'm trying to understand the legal issues, but I didn't go to law school, you know? And I'm thinking to myself, maybe I'm jumping in too deep. So when you look at the Dahl test, and did you find that you could master some of those scientific issues there wasn't a problem? Or do we get into situations where we have to be careful? Maybe we shouldn't attempt something, even though we want to.
Well, I attempted it. That's obvious. You got the two covers there. In the back, it's between two covers. Maybe I shouldn't have. Or maybe I was crazy. I often thought I was. I'm definitely out of my depth. I'm not a psychologist. But I just said, look, just put what you know out there. Put what is known out there by others, and let the reader decide. I think you can make a very good argument that the Dal test was a primitive examination or exploration of Black racial identity at an early time in the history of psychology. And it didn't answer everything. It may not have gotten a lot of things right. It may have gotten some things right, but damn it. I mean, this thing there have been 3 movies that have been partly founded on this. The doll industry actually has hired a PhD, a Black scholar who did a doll test dissertation. And so the doll industry today uses the concepts that the Clarks developed to bring in more people from the outside, diverse groups, to look at the design of each one of their dolls. What I'm trying to say is, look, got all these young people and scholars doing doll tests of their own. These people had a hell of an impact on our society, our popular culture, and our law. And to just say, well, no, this is too difficult. I don't want to try it. Nah, I waded right in, and probably incautiously, and I'll catch hell now and then for doing it. But somebody needed to do it.
Folks, if you have a copy of your book, you can bring it up here to be signed following the program. There's also copies for sale from our bookstore partner, Seminary Co-op, in the back. I want to thank all of you for being here, but most of all, I want to thank Tim for that wonderful discussion and for writing the Clark story. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, and thanks for everyone.